Okay, welcome back on page 356, talking about fail-safe. Ready to move on, talking about approaches and selecting products. So, there's the technical and policy related things. So what is the environment, the system environment, the current security protection that you have? What are the goals of the system? Is the threat primarily from the outside, or perhaps it's inside? And maybe I don't even know. I'll put an IDS in, a simple one at the beginning, to find out the answer to that question, and then go back and get more. Okay. And then what's the existing policy? How's it structured? Does it include like job descriptions and things that would deter illegal activity? Management focused things. So then, okay, so kind of technical and kind of, testing the waters kind of, what's the environment? And then the organizational constraints. Sometimes these things are required by some sort of an organization or a standard or something. Do you have public access to your system at all? I mean, if I was really, really big, a big organization, I would probably probably instead of doing like a DMZ kind of a scenario, I'd have two completely separate systems. Here's my internal one. Here's my external one. I wouldn't bother putting them put them in the same building. Okay. Any relevant laws like HIPAA or FERPA or something that requires encryption, things of that nature? Are there what's the audit requirements? If I'm going to do my due diligence, hey, that's that term again. What do I have to say that this thing is actually working? Do I need a report of some sort that says yes, it's working? And maybe you're doing some sort of a system accreditation, like the Army type system, where you're trying to determine whether it meets a common criteria goal or not. And then resources, these things are not cheap. So acquisition cost and life cycle costs, because you're going to have to maintain it. You got to have a human, and you're going to be doing updates. Staff could be full time, right? And then you need to provide the authority to react. We remember the story about Target, where they didn't have that authority. And then features and qualities. Is it sufficiently scalable? Now, all the manufacturers are going to say, well, of course. But then you need to go look. Properly tested in the environment you're planning on using it in. Like, for example, let's say you have very little wireless, okay? And so you buy this system that's designed just for wired. And then, okay, somebody wakes up one day and says, this is dumb. Let's switch everything over to wireless. And so they rewire everything, and now your IDS is really not the right choice. And then user level experiences, yeah. And then support provisions, is there, software updates? Is there tech support? Are the timely response? Are they going to come on site and teach your staff? Okay. Strengths and limitations, page 360. So the strengths, monitoring system events and behavior, user behavior, that's great. I can test security states. I can say, hey, let's pretend like, and try that. Generate a security baseline so I know what's real, know how often we're being attacked, that kind of stuff. Recognizing patterns, because I've had this thing up for a while, and being able to alert the staff when things go wrong. Limitations. It really can't compensate for a poorly configured firewall. I mean, this is supposed to be after your firewall has done its thing. Okay. And 0 day, of course, is tough. Now, it can react to a 0 day, but it won't know what it's doing or why. It's going to say, something funky is going on. I'm taking this action. So you have to be very careful of those guys. And then any type of real investigation going to require a human to go back through. Deployment on page 361. Obviously, there are some choices of where you put IDS and how you manage them. So IDS are going to be considered a prime target for hackers. In other words, think about this. If I'm casing a building and I see it has a burglar alarm, I'm going to attack the burglar alarm first, right? I'm going to figure out how to open the window without setting off the alarm, with the use of magnets or something, right? I'm going to find out how and then after I've done that, then I can attack your system. Okay. So what a lot of people do is use different types of IDS, perhaps even different brands. So you don't have just one brand of something. you have multiple ones. So, if they go in and say, aha, I see you're using brand XYZ. And so I know exactly what wire to clip to make that alarm go away. Well, when they get there, it's 2 or 3 systems. So multiple types is almost always a good idea. And then control strategies. Do you want to have centralized, everything gets sent to one thing? You want it fully distributed, or some sort of hybrid thing? So here's what centralized would look like. So I have all these sensors going on. I've got an IDS console, and I've got, the firewall and all the rest of that stuff. And so I'm detecting, monitoring, and I'm doing host base, and I'm doing application, doing all this stuff simultaneously. And it's all going into one system. And I could go to the console here and find out what's going on. Okay. So the reason why you might want to do this is the cost and control, right? I have great control and a relatively low cost, but I do have all my eggs in one basket if that's of interest to you. So this is okay, but looking at all these things is probably one point. My IDS console, if you could accidentally unplug that machine, during a reconnaissance run. Maybe you're delivering water, for the little jug water fountains, and you accidentally, unplug this guy, and then you come back the next night and wreak havoc. A fully distributed kind of sounds like it is. Like I've got, okay, this network segment has its own. This network set has its own. So, I'm doing like the whole partitioning of a ship. One iceberg can't take it out because I've got watertight doors. Okay. So each one of the watertight doors has its own set, its own firewall, its own IDS, the whole shebang. So this is a lot more moving parts. Obviously, it's a little bit more expensive because I got to have multiple machines, multiple stuff going on. It could be a little bit faster than the centralized, not by much, guys. Don't take much into that. So this is recording a whole bunch of stuff, and it could be overwhelming. Here, clearly, the amount it's taking in is going to be less, so it could, in theory, react faster. And then, of course, partially distributed, which kind of makes sense, some sort of a hybrid, where I just go in and say, well, here's where I think things ought to be, and over here I'm doing this, but over here I'm doing that. And then deployment. Where do you put these things? Now, the network-based ones, the choices are fairly obvious. I want to put it on the other side of the firewall, okay? And I could put one incoming from the internet. I could. And then on the other side of the firewall, and then inside this one particular segment, and then inside this one. I'm not sure why I'd even want to collect data before the first firewall. It would probably be just so overwhelming. I don't know. Anyway, so do localized segments of the network match their intended use? Let's just talk about it. Let's say, for example, this organization, whatever it is a 24-hour operation. And so I expect, network traffic and activity. But over here, this is a 9 to 5, 5-day-a-week scenario. So I've broken them up logically, like this is manufacturing with 3 shifts, or down here is this. So, the actual, let's use a hospital, the nurses station and all that stuff, but the blood bank, isn't open 24/7, So certain things are open all the time. And so I expect activity. And then, the administrator's office and the billing office, that is not open all the time. So it would make sense to have sensors based upon the location of the LAN, and the LAN has its own set of things. Make sense? Okay. All right. So if I have a lab environment, maybe that'll be different. Okay. And then host space is kind of obvious. Where's the sensor go? Well, it goes on the host. Come on. You could have multiple sensors per host, right? For example, if I had web and email on the same physical server, well, then I'd probably have 2 specialized sensors, one for web traffic, one for email. Measuring the effectiveness. I've got this system up and running. Now I want to check to see if it makes any sense. So the threshold, the maximum acceptable level, the blacklist, it could be like port numbers or file names or file extensions. Like I don't allow this to, these types of files to leave the organization. You could have that kind of stuff. Alert settings, you can set the priority settings and the methods of alerts. And then, of course, you have to test these things to make sure they work. So measuring the effectiveness of your IDs requires a little bit of testing. If you know what the acceptable threshold is, you could tweak it for a test and then put it back, or you could leave it alone and blast away. The next one is a little bit complicated. On page 367, they talk about, honeypots and honey nets and padded cells. Mostly, this is stuff from Hollywood. I mean, yes, there's, Richard Stoll, the Cuckoo's Egg, weaves this great story about how, he's at Berkeley and he sees traffic and he tries to track it down. But they would, in order to keep them this is back in the dial-in days, to keep them on the line long enough to be able to trace the call. You've seen that in movies, right? Like the kidnappers call the number and they say, keep them talking. We need a little time. So he created, a thing called a honeypot, which basically a fake server with an enticing name like Secrets. And that would make the guy spend more time, and so you could track the call. The problem is, having a decoy for bad guys to come in to lure an attacker away. Yes, it diverts an attack from real to fake data, gives you time to collect data on the person, and perhaps, delay them so you can even collect more information. Now, is that a real viable thing you should do? Probably not. First of all, it's expensive. It's time consuming to set up and operate. And unless you had a specific need, I wouldn't recommend it. And then padded cells, basically the same thing. The IDS basically just sends them off to a harmless location. So again, advantages and disadvantages. So attackers can be diverted. Yay! So they can't really do any damage. Attackers can have time to decide how to respond, Attackers' actions can be easily modified. But let's talk about legal implications using such, in the early days of computing, not now, but in the early days, someone could say, but you enticed me by having these really interesting names for these servers and these files. You had a folder called Top Secret. And, I just naturally, out of curiosity, had to go there. So you can't blame it all on me. You enticed me. Now, those arguments don't hold up much now because there are specific, criminal statutes that were designed to make sure that's not happening. But, they're not really well known and not well understood. And no one can show you that they actually work. Okay, that's the real thing. And then the other one could be, you're really going to piss some people off. And do you really want to piss off an attacker? I don't know. Maybe you do. Tap and trace. The term is from old days in phone system. It's become a legal term because we're talking about being able to trace the phone calls, etc. No, we're not talking about transcripts of the phone calls or recording of the actual phone call, but we're talking about the time period, to, from, when, and how long. Okay, that kind of stuff. So tap and trace, I could put a recorder on every incoming call coming to a particular number, right? You suspect somebody, is doing something nefarious. So you say, I want to put a tap and trace. You go to the phone company. I want to do a tap and trace for every call, incoming or outgoing, from this number, and you give them the number. A pin register, again, these are ancient terms, but basically talking about all outgoing calls. Okay, so in Hollywood, it talks about, how long do you have to keep them on the line before you can do the trap thing, the trace thing. Is that real today, or do modern phone systems have a unique way of doing that? Yeah, I mean, hey, with caller ID, I know exactly who's calling me, and I don't have to figure it out, right? It's all right there on the screen, so I don't need any of that stuff anymore. All that stuff from Hollywood, that's ancient history. Okay, once again, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark.